All right, guys, chapter 4, part 3. We are in a speakeasy. Nick came into town with Gatsby. Tom Buchanan shows up, and all of a sudden, Gatsby mysteriously disappears. Tom has been kind of berating Nick. Hey, where you been all summer, Nick? Daisy's been angry you haven't come to visit. Why does Gatsby disappear? When Tom shows up, what is this favor that Gatsby wants of Nick? And you want Jordan Baker to talk to Nick about? And what does it say about Gatsby that he has mobster friends who fixed the 1919 World Series? All of this stuff is coming together. I turned toward Mr. Gatsby, but he was no longer there. One October day in 1970, Jordan Baker now is telling us a story in the past when she was growing up with Daisy. One October day in 1917, said Jordan Baker that afternoon, sitting up very straight on a straight chair in the tea garden at the Plaza Hotel. I was walking along from one place to another, half on the sidewalks and half on the lawns. I was happier on the lawns because I had shoes on from England with rubber knobs in the soles that bit into the soft ground. I had on a new plaid skirt also that blew a little in the wind, and whenever this happened, the red, white, and blue banners in front of all the houses stretched out stiff and said tut, 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 tut in a disapproving way. The largest of the banners and the largest of the lawns belonged to Daisy Faye's house. So she grew up with Daisy. She was just 18, 2 years older than me, and by far the most popular of all the young girls in Louisville. So remember, Daisy and Jordan grew up in the Midwest. Old money still. She dressed in white and had a little white roadster, and all day long the telephone rang in her house, and excited young officers from Camp Taylor demanded the privilege of monopolizing her that night, anyways, for an hour. When I came opposite her house that morning, her white roadster was beside the curb, and she was sitting in it with a lieutenant I had never seen before. They were so engrossed in each other that she didn't see me until I was 5 feet away. Hello, Jordan, she called unexpectedly. Please come here. I was flattered that she wanted to speak to me because of all the older girls, I admired her most. She asked me if I was going to the Red Cross and make bandages. So again, this is in the days during World War One. I was. Well, then would I tell them that she wouldn't come that day? The officer looked at Daisy while she was speaking in a way that every young girl wants to be looked at sometime, and because it seemed romantic to me, I have remembered the incident ever since. His name was Jay Gatsby, and I didn't lay eyes on him again for over 4 years. Even after I'd met him on Long Island, I didn't realize he was the same man. That was 1917. By next year, I had a few bows myself and began to play in tournaments, so I didn't see Daisy very often. She went with a slightly older crowd when she went with anyone at all. Wild rumors were circulating about her, how her mother had found her packing her bag one winter night to go to New York and say goodbye to a soldier who was going overseas. She was effectively prevented, but she wasn't on speaking terms with her family for several weeks. After that, she didn't play around with the soldiers anymore, but only with a few flat-footed, short-sighted young men in town who couldn't get into the army at all. By the next autumn, she was gay again, gay as ever, happy. She had a debut after the armistice. The peace was declared throughout the world, and in February, she was presumably engaged to a man from New Orleans. In June, she married Tom Buchanan of Chicago with more pomp and circumstance than Louisville ever knew before. He came down with 100 people in 4 private cars and hired a whole floor of the Sealback Hotel. And the day before the wedding, he gave her a string of pearls valued at $350,000. Remember, that's 1917 dollars. I was a bridesmaid. I came into her room half an hour before the bridal dinner and found her lying on her bed as lovely as the June night in her flowered dress and as drunk as a monkey. She had a bottle of Sauternay in one hand and a letter in the other. Congratulate me, she muttered. Never had a drink before, but oh, how I enjoy it. What's the matter, Daisy? I was scared, I could tell you. I'd never seen a girl like that before. Here there is. She groped around in a wastebasket she had with her on the bed and pulled out the string of pearls. Take them downstairs and give them back to whoever they belong to. Tell them how Daisy's changed her mind. Say, Daisy's changed her mind. She began to cry. She cried and cried. I rushed out and found her mother's maid, and we locked the door and got into a cold bath. She wouldn't let go of the letter. She took it into the tub with her and squeezed it up into a wet ball and only let me leave it in the soap dish when she saw it was coming to pieces like snow. But she didn't say another word. We gave her spirits of ammonia and put ice on her forehead and hooked her back into her dress. And half an hour later, when we walked out of the room, the pearls were around her neck and the incident was over. Next day at 5 o'clock, she married Tom Buchanan without so much as a shiver and started off on a 3 month trip to the South Seas. I saw them in Santa Barbara when they came back, and I thought I'd never seen a girl so mad about her husband. If you left the room for a minute, she'd look around uneasily and say, "Where's Tom gone?" and wear the most abstracted expression until she saw him coming in the door. She used to sit on the sand with his head in her lap by the hour, rubbing her fingers over his eyes and looking at him with unfathomable delight. It was touching to see them together. It made you laugh in a hushed, fascinated way. That was in August. A week after I left Santa Barbara, Tom ran into a wagon on the Ventura Road one night and ripped a front wheel off his car. Remember the metaphor earlier about careless drivers. It's going to keep reappearing in the text. The girl who was with him got into the papers too because her arm was broken. She was one of the chambermaids in the Santa Barbara hotel. The next April, Daisy had her little girl, and they went to France for a year. I saw them one spring in Cannes and later in Deauville, and then they came back to Chicago to settle down. Daisy was popular in Chicago, you know. They moved with a fast crowd, all of them young and rich and wild, but she came out with an absolutely perfect reputation, perhaps because she doesn't drink. It's a great advantage not to drink among hard drinking people. You could hold your tongue, and moreover, you could time any little irregularity of your own so that everybody else is so blind they don't see or care. Perhaps Daisy never went in for amour at all, and yet there's something in that voice of hers. Well, about 6 weeks ago, she heard the name Gatsby for the first time in years. It was when I asked you, do you remember, if you knew Gatsby in West Egg? After you had gone home, she came into my room and woke me up and said, "What Gatsby?" And when I described him, I was half asleep. She said in the strangest voice that it must be the man she used to know. It wasn't until then that I connected this Gatsby with the officer in her car. When Jordan had finished telling all of this, we had left the plaza for half an hour and were driving in a Victoria through Central Park. The sun had gone down behind the tall apartments of the movie stars in the West 50s, and the clear voices of girls already gathered like crickets on the grass rose through the hot twilight. I'm the Sheik of Araby, your love belongs to me. At night when you're asleep, in your tent I'll creep. Some music from the 20s. It was a strange coincidence, I said, but it wasn't a coincidence at all. Why not? Gatsby bought that house so that Daisy would be just across the bay. Then it had not been merely the stars to which he had aspired on that June night. He came alive to me, delivered suddenly from the womb of his purposeless splendor. Okay, the moment we first saw Gatsby, Nick came home from Daisy and Tom's house across the bay, from his house, right? There's a green light. He sees Gatsby in the shadows reaching out toward a green light across the bay. We know now what, or rather whom, he was reaching out toward. He wants to know, continued Jordan, if you'll invite Daisy to your house some afternoon and then let him come over. The modesty of the demand shook me. He had waited 5 years and bought a mansion where he dispensed starlight to casual moths so that he could come over some afternoon to a stranger's garden. Did I have to know all this before he could ask such a little thing? He's afraid he's waited so long he thought you might be offended. You see, he's a regular tough underneath it all. Something worried me. Why didn't he ask you to arrange a meeting? He wants her to see his house, she explained, and your house is right next door. Oh, I think he half expected her to wander into. Well, oh, Jordan's talking. I'm sorry. I think he half expected her to wander into one of his parties some night. Went on Jordan, but she never did. Then he began asking people casually if they knew her, and I was the first one he found. It was that night he sent for me at his dance, and you should have heard the elaborate way he worked up to it. Of course, I immediately suggested a lunch in New York, and I thought he'd go mad. I don't want to do anything out of the way. He kept saying, I want to see her right next door. When I said you were a particular friend of Tom's, he started to abandon the whole idea. He doesn't know very much about Tom, though he says he's been reading a Chicago newspaper for years just on the chance of catching a glimpse of Daisy's name. It was dark now, and as we dipped under a little bridge, I put my arm around Jordan's golden shoulder and drew her toward me and asked her to dinner. Suddenly, I wasn't thinking of Daisy and Gatsby anymore, but of this clean, hard, limited person who dealt in universal skepticism and who leaned back jauntily just within the circle of my arm. A phrase began to beat in my ears with a sort of heady excitement. There are only the pursued, the pursuing, the busy, and the tired. And Daisy ought to have something in her life, murmured Jordan to me. Does she want to see Gatsby? She's not supposed to know about it. Gatsby doesn't want her to know. You're just supposed to invite her to tea. We passed a barrier of dark trees, and then the facade of 59th Street, a block of delicate pale light beamed down into the dark. Unlike Gatsby and Tom Buchanan, I had no girl whose disembodied face floated along the dark cornices and blinding signs, and so I drew up the girl beside me, tightening my arms. Her wan, scornful mouth smiled, and so I drew her up again, closer this time to my face. That ends chapter 4 with this bombshell of it kind of explains all of Gatsby's existence in one fell swoop. And I'll leave you to the chapter questions, which I'm going to share back in Google Classroom.